Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, and we're continuing our conversations about the cultures of consciousness. Almost 20 years ago, I read a novel by a great science fiction writer, Greg Egan, who should be better known and more read. Not always the most deep in his characterization, but full of fascinating ideas. In this novel, Distress, there was a short part where the hero, the protagonist, who was a science journalist, interviewed an autistic fellow who was an advocate for autism, and he had this radical claim, which really struck me at the time, and in fact, I remembered it better than I remembered almost everything else in the book, that had to do with, rather than seeing autism, which is, of course, a complicated thing to exactly define and is a term that is constantly in negotiation, certainly today, that what was often seen as deficit with this mode, the lack of, let's say, empathy, lack of understanding of other people's social cues, the sort of seeming lack of engagement with some of the personality motivations that quote-unquote normals, neurotypicals have, that instead of seeing this as deficits, that these were actually evolutionary advances beyond the kind of simian social programming that defines the majority of human beings. And I remember reading this at the time and being really struck by it, and it was so shocking and new and bizarre, but sort of weirdly true. But that was 20 years ago, before the rise of a sort of robust discourse around autism and around what it is, how to think about it. And right now there's all sorts of stuff going on about, indeed, whether to see this as a disease, to link it to technology, to how do we define the difference between high-functioning autistics and low-functioning autistics? Do we create a different word for it? There's a lot of discourse that's going on right now, and it's a fascinating place to see precisely what this show is about, which is how we understand the nature of perception and consciousness, how we organize it, how our stories in turn shape our experience of these things. And so I'm very, very happy to have Jason Horsley on the show today, not simply because he writes very intelligently and in a fascinating way about autism, but he's also just a very interesting thinker and extremely prolific writer and creator. I first came across his work long ago when he wrote a book about the Matrix called Matrix Warrior, Being the One, which was kind of a Carlos Castaneda-esque take on the message of the Matrix. And I remember I didn't read the whole book. I just heard about it. It was like, oh, it seems kind of interesting. I should get around to this at some point. Seemed like it might be a little bit silly or whatever. And then later on, so his name was in my head, but it wasn't until much later, till quite recently, that Jason sent me a wonderful essay that he had written about Philip K. Dick. And this sent me off into looking at his more recent writings, his articles about Whitley Strieber. He has tons of books and has written a great deal about film and made some films himself. So he's a very productive fellow. But what I found is that he's one of those rare thinkers, and I think of the George Hansen is another one. We've had him on this show, who goes quite far into the weird. And yet maintains a very sensible grounding based on a sociological understanding of what's going on in things like ufology or psychedelia or paranormal experiences, but also really using the whole discussion not to either promote or debunk, but to explore the nature of reality and to some extent his reality, his own experience, his own perceptual engagement with the world, his own traumas, and his own experience as an autistic person who's trying to understand what it means, how to think about it, how to move forward, how to reconceive the social experience we have around autistic people and the spectrum of experiences associated with it. So I really look forward to this conversation. I'm sure we will not have enough time to get to all the good stuff, but before we bring Jason onto the show, our co-host here on Expanding Mind, Maja Dao. Hey, Maja.
Hey, Erik.
How you doing?
I'm doing good. You know, I had a profound experience. I went to go see an autistic savant, and this kid was like 12 years old, and he was a piano player, and he played at, I don't know if you've been in L.A. at that Masonic Hall at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery. It's like one of the most awesome places to see shows. But he played there, and he came up, and his mom was there, like, holding him and talking for him and speaking for him. And, you know, I try to practice techniques where I can, you know, be empathetic and do psychic stuff. You know, it's like my whole job. And, you know, I could feel him. As soon as he got on the stage, I could feel him so strongly. It was all feeling, all emotion, like all, it was palpable, even though he was like, you know, he couldn't talk, he couldn't say anything. And I mean, this kid, he this super pretentious jerk who introduced and played like the piano first to kind of like say, oh yeah, I was his piano teacher. And he played this super stiff piece. I can't even remember what it was. And then this kid gets on, man. Everyone was weeping. He played this Rachmaninoff piece that he had literally like heard on the radio and then just played it back. But it was like he played it with his entire soul, and there was no question that you couldn't feel it like on a super palpable level, more than, you know, the douchey dude that went on and played piano before him. So for me, like, the way I have experienced autism, you know, is like you say, like, there's something happening there on an evolutionary level. And just because, like you said, they're not like norms, I feel like the real tragedy is not that autistic people can't communicate with us. It's that we're so stupid we can't figure out how to feel them.
Exactly. Well, that's a great way to lead to our guest. Jason, thanks so much for joining us on Expanding Mind.
Hi, Erik. Thanks for having me.
Yes, it's great. So you're calling from Canada, right? Where are you in Canada?
In British Columbia.
Wonderful, wonderful. So, yeah, let's just start in on this topic. I mean, you sent me a text that you had recently written about not just the Philip K. Dick text, which relates his experiences to autism, but a fascinating piece called Autism and the Other. And you know, just to give it a little bit of context, what you were addressing is something that again, you do a wonderful job of finding those things, at least in my experience, that I kind of noticed, but in my peripheral vision, and I don't quite put the pieces together. And the pieces you were putting together here was the way in which so many of our more recent serial killers, or I mean, not serial killers, but shooters, for any number of events still resonating in our heads, Sandy Hook being the most recent, that in many of the descriptions there's this sort of presumption and even sometimes explicit accusation that there's an element of autism in these characters. And I realized as soon as you wrote this, like, wow, that's right. I have in my own head unconsciously developed a kind of template of these loner killer shooters that has this character of some sort of relationship with an idea I have about autistic people. And I'm like, where does that come from? And you did a really interesting job of talking about how autism functions as an other for us right now. And so I just love you to talk a little bit more about your thesis there, what got you on that particular, your tack, and how it fit into your own understanding of your own experience.
Okay, I'll give it my best shot. It's it's difficult for me to keep track of where I'm at. Like the piece I sent you, I've actually since rewritten it. I revisited it, and I found that my point of view is very different just in a few months. And one of the things I felt was missing from the piece that you read was my own personal journey, my own personal exploration of these ideas. So, like, to understand my own perspective on these things is kind of like understanding my own perspective on myself. So, I first started writing about Sandy Hook, not from a point of view of parapolitics or conspiracy theories, which, as you know, was stuff I'd written about in the past, but because of the autism angle. And it was because it coincided with this movie, We Need to Talk About Kevin, which I had seen the year before because my niece recommended it. And my niece is like 16 now. She was about 14 and 15 when she recommended it. And she shares with me this passion for movies that I had at her age and which I still have. So I saw the movie, and I was very disturbed by it because, as you've read the piece, it presents this sort of stereotypical autistic type as basically monstrous, as without any feelings and cruel and manipulative and cunning, kind of like Damien in the Omen movies almost, but in a more realistic fashion. And although it doesn't identify Kevin as autistic and even has a little scene where the doctor says, no, he can't be autistic because he doesn't rock, I felt like that was just kind of just deflecting really from, because he had basically many of the characteristics of autistic, so he fit the stereotype. So anyway, it bothered me, the movie, and I wrote about it at the forum Rigorous Intuition. I just wrote my feelings about it and about autism and my experience of autism being on the spectrum, or at least having recognized myself as having characteristics of Asperger's syndrome. And then that was pretty much it. There was a discussion for a couple of weeks that was fairly fruitful. And then when Sandy Hook happened and Adam Lanza was identified as being Aspergerian, I just thought, well, here we go. This is life imitating art. And I got sucked into it because, as you will remember, the whole Sandy Hook thing was huge. I mean, the hysteria around it and the panic and the moral uproar and all the rest of it. And the element of Adam Lanza being Aspergerian or on the autistic spectrum was obviously critical, because here you have this incident that is perhaps poorly understood, but there's this strong emotional response to it. How could this happen? How can we prevent something like this from happening in the future? And then you've got this kind of unknown, the X factor. Oh, he was on the autistic spectrum. That must be it, because there's just this basic fundamental need to try and understand horrific events and distance ourselves from them, both in the sense of how can we avoid them, but also in the sense of how can we avoid taking responsibility for them, which in my opinion is actually the worst way to understand. I mean, that's the opposite way to actually understand something and avoid it in the future is not to take responsibility for it, but it's just a kind of psychological mechanism of wanting to distance oneself from horror. And so
it seems like there's this need to project, and there's particular qualities, and it's also interesting. Again, I can't help but thinking of it through some of the Philip K. Dick material, but to talk about that. But just in terms of the fear that constructs this image of a kind of autistic killer, with a sense, this lack of empathy, this burst of violence. I mean, that one of the features in people with stronger autism is that sometimes there are these crazy tantrums that you just come out of nowhere, and you're like, whoa, where is this coming from? And so you can see how these elements of reality get put together into this kind of stereotypic profile. But there are, you can see how it happens, why it happens, why is it this cluster right now? And I'd love to answer it, as opposed to other kinds of stereotypes, other kinds of fantasies we might have about these kids. Let's say they're driven by video games. There's a classic one. But in a way, the autistic one is more interesting. It goes deeper. It tells us more about where we are right now in society and how we're dealing with the mind, et cetera, et cetera. So why now? What is it about the autistic temperament right now that makes it such a hot button issue?
Well, I think two things are coinciding, Eric, because as we've just touched on, the fear and the panic around these kind of incidents and the growing kind of violence or incomprehensible violence in society, I guess particularly American society, and then there is what is being called the autism epidemic in and of itself, like separately, that there's a lot of fear around autism. People have kids and they're going to be afraid that their child is autistic. If the child acts a little bit odd, if it doesn't communicate verbally, oh my God, maybe my child's autistic. And there's a stigma around autism which is very strong. I've noticed, having done the research. I mean, there's certain points of view that having a child with autism is like worse than having a child with terminal cancer, because they live a full life kind of thing. I mean, ironically or paradoxically, it's considered, autism is seen as so terrible a fate that it would be better if a child were to die prematurely of leukemia or something.
Well, and I'd like to interject there. Yeah. That fear is actually because the parents don't want to have to do the work to deal with an autistic child.
Well, I think that's definitely part of it, of course.
Yeah.
But I mean, that would be very callous if it was only that. And I think it's more than just the physical work. It's the emotional and psychological work. Because when a person has a child, and I'm not a parent, so I can't speak from experience. But what I've seen and observed of people who are parents, and being a child of parents myself, when a person has a child, that child comes from them physically, but also psychically. So a child is an extension of them, and whatever we disown as an individual, but also collectively, which is where the autism epidemic comes into context psychologically, what we disown will come back to us, a bit like the horror theme of the return of the repressed. It will come back to us manifest and embodied through the child. So it's very that to actually deal as a parent with having an autistic child means dealing with kind of the most suppressed and the most disowned and the most unconscious aspects of themselves, which by definition are the very things they don't want to see. And I think that this is the communication gulf, because autists, they are sentient. I mean, even the low-functioning nonverbal ones, which in the past and still today are assumed to be quote-unquote retarded or just mentally absent, more and more evidence is proving really that they're not absent at all. Like, example with the pianist, they're absolutely present, they're absolutely sentient, but their way of communicating and their way of behaving is so foreign that we're not able to recognize it. So it is almost like they're embodying an unconscious aspect of ourselves, and that by definition we can't actually recognize it or identify it because it doesn't fit with our idea about what being human is, or what being sentient is, or what intelligence is.
Yeah, and let's take this a little farther, because you really wind up with a pretty radical. It's not exactly a claim; it's a suggestion, and that's again something I really admire about your writing, is that you surf a lot of radical concepts that trip up a lot of people, and then they fall into proclaiming the truth of the conspiracy or the whatever the thing is, and you ride the edge of it in a really interesting way, and yet it is a powerful concept, not unlike the idea in the Greg Egan book, which is this notion that part of what the autist is incapable of sort of emotionally and cognitively identifying with is this kind of social game of cultural maintenance through language and symbol, and the kind of the clearly extremely driven sense of social relationship and sort of where do I fit into these social networks, that all of this maintained by culture, maintained by language, is in some sense foreign to the autist, and that this gives him or her an angle, a perspective, a vision, and a capacity, possibly, and certainly sometimes truly, as this example of the pianist is, a capacity for a kind of emotional engagement and a perceptual engagement with the world that is potentially much more acute than what we neurotypicals, who are embedded deeply in human, cultural, social, semiotic nets, are capable of doing. I mean, it's a fascinating idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, one of the things I realized I've had to face while working on this piece is that the question of autism is a political one. We're talking about political reality here, and that, the idea of actually seeing the world and experiencing the self in a way that is totally foreign, totally alien. I could say totally new, but it may not be new. It may just be that, consensus reality or social reality hasn't been able to acknowledge it, but whatever, it appears new. That possibility is far more threatening than any kind of social, political movement could ever be, because if you perceive reality in a totally different way, then it's almost like an immunity to brainwashing, to propaganda, to the values that society propagates and depends on in order to continue functioning.
Talk a little bit more about that. How we can think about what that difference is, not only in its ability to not be drawn into propaganda, social concepts, values, the sort of regulation by signs and language, but also what are the positive characteristics that you sense or suspect lie in that?
Well, I'll give an example that I've included in the piece since you read it, which is synesthesia. The synesthesia is when a person experiences the different sensory stimuli overlapping. So a person will hear a sound and see a corresponding color, or they will smell something and they will have a visual impression of that smell, or they will and so on and so forth. I mean, a very simple example, which I was aware of as a kid, is that the days of the week have specific colors for me, and numbers might also have colors. This is something that even seemingly ordinary people might have a sort of sense of that, but when synesthesia is full on, it's actually like experiencing the senses simultaneously. So there isn't that clear categorization that separates a vision from sound, from sensory data, from smell, and so on. And so you can imagine if a person were living in a synesthetic reality, I call it synesthesia as like a country, as compared to neurotypica, they simply wouldn't recognize the categories of reality that we recognize. And never mind, I mean, we argue in neurotypica, we argue about the difference between democracy and communism or fascism, and we argue about which religion or which spiritual system is correct. And those seem like real distinctions to us. But for somebody who's existing in synesthesia, forget about it. They're not even recognizing necessarily the difference between their leg and your nose or something. I mean, I don't know, because I don't actually remember what this experience is like, or I think we've all had it as infants. I think it's a state in which the senses are completely open. So to get to your question, while that on the one hand would mean that a person was kind of immune to or insensible to the categories of reality and the social mores and values that we consider essential fundamentals to being human. On the other hand, it would be they would be perceiving the environment in a way that was not just different, but I mean radically different. That I guess we can only really imagine. But if you were able to see, or rather experience, say, a human being from all these different angles, so that you weren't just seeing them, but you were also having an oral impression and the smell, and I mean, I think that animals to some extent have this kind of all-round 360-degree perceptual experience, and that's kind of related to them being in tune with their environment. But and so that's a survival-based thing. But I think what I touched on in the piece is that human beings, and this is Joseph Chilton Pearce's model, our brains are very different than most of the, or all of the other animals, and our brains develop much more slowly. We have longer childhoods because they have the potential for tuning into the whole Earth and to many different spectrums of experience on the planet. And so I think that this is what we're seeing with the autistic potential, that it's almost...
Well, let me just cut in, because what it really is bringing up for me right now is it's a classic example. So one of the things that someone would say, contrary to your view, they'd say, well, look, obviously maybe it's wonderful to have these synesthetic experiences, but because these individuals are not capable of communicating, they're not actually able to function, and it's basically regressive. That would be the kind of traditional argument. In fact, even some of the mystical experiences and deep states of perception that you and I, all of us here, are really interested in, will be seen by some people as being regressive, and people will even describe, so what, you had an experience of oneness, it's this autistic space where you can't communicate, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. It reminds me of Ken Wilber's idea of the pre-trans fallacy, which to me is one of the most important ideas, certainly that he came up with. I think it's his best contribution to thought, and that's the idea that there are states that can look from a rational point of view as a regressive state that are actually, let's put it, transgressive or transpersonal or more evolved. So that from the rational point of view, you can look at the Freudian perspective. The unconscious is a seething mass of inchoate anger and lust. And you're like, well, it's partly that, but it's also partly these states that the Freudian is saying is regressive. They're also transcendent. They're beyond and more integral, more expansive, more multidimensional, more intelligent, more perceptive, potentially, than
Erik, to add to that really quick, all the shamans regress, right? Like shamans say, in order to transcend, to get to that spiritual side, go back to the source. So you have to regress. So that's, I feel like, very true.
And that's something that, Jason, that you talk about a lot, that part of the way through, the way out of this cage we've built for ourselves that's destroying the earth in some sense, out of the way that this cage we built, we have to go down. We have to go through trauma. We have to go through darkness. We have to go through shadow. It's not, you can't skip that. And that seems to be something that's really an important point for your work and your own personal experience of these things.
Yeah, that was what was coming to mind when you were talking. Well, actually, a few things are coming to my mind. Because I've been on my own path. I've had my own trans fallacy, whatever it's called. And I've had to recognize, that there is a tendency to not just regress in order to resolve or integrate or understand or dissolve earlier trauma, but in order to kind of recapture the original capacity to dissociate that was caused by trauma. And I think that autism does speak to this. I think autism isn't just one thing any more than being human is just one thing. That there is an aspect or an element of autism which is dissociative, which is avoiding quote-unquote reality or interconnection or a sense of being a separate being. Nothing is just one thing, and it seems like I think we have, as part of the neurotypical point of view, is that things have to be either or. Things have to be, we've got this inbuilt value system where we're constantly evaluating things. Is this good or is this bad? Rather than is this right for me and is this necessary? So I think the journey towards wholeness is just that. It's not about attaining some heightened state of awareness. It's about having a complete experience of oneself. So what I was going to say earlier is that the autism and these capacities, it's not necessarily that they're better than the sort of the way of perceiving that we're used to, but that we've become so, I'll use the word stuck, but so habituated to a certain way of perceiving our environment and interacting with it that we've actually isolated ourselves from a whole other portion of experience. And so I think autism, in a sense, is picking up the slack for the species there.
That's a wonderful way of putting it. That's great. Hey, so we're going to take a break right now, but we'll be right back. We've got another half an hour discussion. You're listening to Expanding Mind with Erik Davis and Maja Daou, and we're talking with Jason Horsley. So hold on.
Welcome back to Expanding Mind on the Progressive Radio Network. This is Maja Daou. You're talking with Erik Davis and Jason Horsley about autism and science fiction and wholeness and all of those fun things. Before the break, we were talking a little bit about, that symbolism of trauma and trying to come back to wholeness. And along those lines, I wanted to ask you a little bit about some of your UFO papers that you wrote. I was a big Whitley Strieber stalker, too, back in the day. So I really enjoyed your papers. But what I found fascinating was this thing that you brought up in your research about that kind of trauma connection and how to perceive the phenomenon of UFOs differently, which, of course, I always like Carl Jung's, which you talk about, too, and Freud, and what do they have to do with perception? And I thought it was so interesting just to keep along the lines of trauma, because in shamanism, the initiation has to do with all these weird beings coming to you and cutting you apart into pieces, and it's a little bit like the whole alien abduction thing, very much so. If you read a lot of the texts, like Mircea Eliade describes it very much that way. And I was wondering if, I know you talk a lot about the Strieber thing and stuff like that, but how, for you personally, how would you, have you had any of those experiences, or was that just kind of you thinking about the material and stuff like that, or did you have any kind of visions or anything like that, or was it more just you trying to put the pieces together?
Well, the pieces I was trying to put together were the pieces of my own psyche, really. I mean, could almost say literally, except psyche isn't literally in pieces, but that was what drew me to Whitley Strieber to begin with, but I didn't recognize it at the time, and so writing this exploration was a way to discover what had attracted me to Strieber, why I'd become so obsessed with that material, and tracing it back to what I would say was my early fragmentation. So, yes, to answer your main question, I had experiences, I would say even before reading Strieber, but certainly after Strieber, I had my own visionary encounters with other beings and whatnot, and pretty much confirmed, in quotes, his accounts to my own satisfaction.
Right.
So then when I began to really deconstruct his narrative for reasons that were based on inconsistencies within his narrative itself, I realized very quickly that I was of necessity deconstructing my own narrative, because I had used Strieber's narrative and the whole UFO thing to sort of paper over the cracks of my own trauma, if you will, and to make sense of it. And I think that's what Strieber's doing. I think that's what we're all doing to one degree or another. But I think the UFO, the whole sort of folklore of it, is fascinating when seen through this lens, because I think it is like we metaphorize, if that's a verb. We turn into metaphor what we can't assimilate consciously, just as this is where myths come from. and the UFO is a modern myth, as Jung pointed out. So I think what you were touching on there made me think of something I hadn't thought of exactly, which is that the beings coming to dismember us, whether we actually have a kind of literal dismemberment experience or whether it's more a Strieber-esque kind of surgery and a medical procedure, but that may well be a way to reenact the psychic dismemberment that happens in infancy due to fragmentation from trauma, in which the psyche actually gets split into many complexes, and so the daemon, as Anthony Peake calls it, becomes many demons, many little sub-personalities.
Well, and when you look at it in shamanic, like, vocabulary, literally, like, that's what all the soul retrieval stuff is about, right? Like, people, that's kind of getting more hip now. People, you can go get a soul retrieval for, like, $19.99 or whatever, but, you know, they say the soul has shards that split off when there's a trauma, right? And then that, like you said, that dismemberment occurs, and then the little beings kind of, not only the demons or the daemons help fractionate, but they're also what's responsible for bringing it back together. And I've thought about this a lot, because if you think about in our society, how do we deal with trauma, right? What are our ways, what are our methods of actually addressing and dealing with trauma? Well, we give people drugs to suppress it, right? Let's just like dope you up a lot so you don't think about that, or, you know, people drink or they self-medicate or they talk. You can talk, right? You can, like, have a conversation with people. But with a lot of things like UFO stuff and trauma, there's this aspect of they'll think you're crazy. So I wonder, like, what you think about the UFO phenomenon of, like, how people that have felt crazy in telling these stories to people, like, how do you think that fills in that psychological part of, like, dealing with the trauma?
I'm not sure, but when you were talking, what occurred to me is that with UFOs, and this is true with psychonauts and a lot of spiritual seekers as well, that there's a tendency to want to turn the experience into a story that reinforces one's own sense of specialness or wholeness. And I think that Erik was touching on this just before the break about how some of these states can actually be regressive in a way that isn't productive or isn't healing, as in a person gets stuck in a regress state and says, yes, I've made it, as opposed to what you were talking about, the shamanic journey into the underworld in order to rediscover and reintegrate those lost parts. That's very different. But you know, we don't have the textbook on it. We don't have examples to follow, so it's very easy to get lost in that process of where we're unconsciously trying to reclaim and re-own the lost aspects of ourselves, to get pulled back into the original fragmentation drama in which we were fragmenting and we learned dissociation. Aha, I can just dissociate off and create this superego, which is only just a fragment too, but it's a fragment that contains all it's like the opposite of the shadow, all of our idealized fantasies about ourselves as being powerful, and that fragment then becomes, we mistake it for the whole psyche, and I think that's what Wilbur was talking about, is my guess. I haven't read him, and I think that's what I noticed with the UFO thing. So although, yeah, it's true that if you have these experiences, and not just UFO, but paranormal in general, society will try and tell you you're crazy a lot of the time, just as if you're autistic. It will try and cure you of that. But it's also true, and I think the two things perhaps go together, that the way that a lot of people, and who knows, a chicken or an egg thing, because it could also be a reaction against society kind of dismissing the experiences, people try and add something to the experience, and they interpret it, and they turn it into something that it isn't, basically. I mean, like, these are extraterrestrials from Sirius engineering our evolution or whatnot. I mean, yeah, maybe, but it's really like, as soon as you try and put a label on it, then it's like that's the complex taking over, I think.
Right. So they're not being responsible, like you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, so it's the process of literalizing, and this raises a really interesting question that you brought up in your Strieber piece, where you're talking about the attraction, but also the trap of liminality, of being in between, of ambiguity, of something being both real and not real. And in a way, what you're calling for is to reclaim these things that people tend to literalize, that there are, Pleiadians who are engineering our evolution, or whatever the literalized fantasy is, the claim that goes, no, this isn't just mythic, no, it isn't just imaginal, this is happening in reality. And you're saying, look, let's see what happens when we deliteralize that, bring it back into the liminal, into the ambiguous, into the open-ended.
Right.
Great. That's sort of the first move. But the second move is the one that I'm a little more interested in now, which is the way in which liminality itself can kind of be a dodge. And you talk about the Mulder complex, based on the character in the X-Files, where he has trauma. His sister was stolen as a kid. He wants to believe, but he also can't entirely believe, because if he totally believed, if he thought these things were real, it would close off the possibility that there was another answer. So there's also a way that people, and certainly people in around ufology and these things, who aren't making the literalist mistake of claiming that these things are true or totally true, but there's also another sort of seduction there that, I still feel, I'm still not sure, I'm working this out myself, how much of my own attraction to these weird things, and these were questions that your own writing stimulated in me. How much of these are based on my own traumas, my own needs to sort of dodge certain hard realities, or am I opening up to just the fundamental nature of the liminal, that it's always part of our lives, this imaginal world of ambiguity? And so that's the question I had for you, is that I can't tell, reading your work, and maybe you're working out yourself, whether you want to ultimately kind of collapse all of this weird stuff into a direct recognition of underlying trauma in your own historical human experience, or whether you want to get close to it, but you're not sure whether you can even get there, and that there's always this kind of imaginal element in the process as well that we also have to honor and kind of work through. Does my question make sense?
It makes some sense. I certainly recognize the ambivalence that you're talking about, that you would experience as a reader, as me being ambiguous because of my own ambivalence. And I am ambivalent by definition. I don't know for sure how real, quote unquote, the experiences I've had in the past are, and how much they are dissociative strategies that I learned very early on as a result of trauma. So what I know is that the trauma was real. As far as I know that I'm here at all. We won't get philosophical about it. My sense about the reality of transcendental beings or liminal states, or that's kind of, I guess I'm absolutely 100% sure about that too, but it's a bit like, becoming conscious in a dream. When you start to become conscious in a dream, you may or may not recognize that it's a dream. I have different experiences of lucid dreaming. Sometimes I become lucid and say, oh, this is a dream, so I can just do anything, and reality is malleable. And so that's a sense of myself being very real, but everything else being unreal. But I also have lucid dreams where I don't realize it's a dream, and I'm just absolutely overwhelmed by the unreality of everything, and I feel trapped within the dream. So I think what I'm getting at here, and with all the stuff I write, is how real is the sense of self, or the idea of a self, the identity that I and probably all of us have identified with or accepted as me. How real is that? Because if that's fundamentally unreal, which I suspect it is, then how can I say, from the point of view of something that is unreal, what is real? Like, what am I going to measure it against, if you see what I mean?
Absolutely. Well, this brings us around to autism. That's one of the points you make there, is that the autist does not maintain the stiff boundary between inside and outside self and environment that neurotypicals do, and that part of the threat and the creative possibility of the autistic perspective has to do with the sort of disturbing truth about the constructed nature of the self. But I want to ask you a personal question. How do you now, with all the thought you've done, all the work you've done, all the analysis that's both an analysis of the world outside, of the way people think about UFOs, of the kind of traps that people come into, but it's also very clearly a work that you're doing through yourself. You're learning about yourself, you're healing, you're achieving insight through your interests, through your intellectual work. How now do you feel your way around this fragile fiction of the self that you're experiencing? How do you practice with that? How do you try to approach that mystery?
Gosh, that's a very difficult question, Eric. I guess the answer that seems real is spontaneously, like without preconceptions, without theories, without intellectual models, without the baggage of all the things that I think I've figured out, or all the values that I've been installed with, of course, but also the values that I've replaced the ones that was installed with, thinking that, no, these are the real values. Like all of that baggage. And the work that I do generally, and it was very clear with the Strieber piece, is a deprogramming, a self-deprogramming. So the sort of irony of that, maybe it's even a bit tragicomic for a writer, is that I end up feeling like, not exactly that I want to disown, but that I've moved beyond the work that I do as soon as I've done it. So like I said, when I went back to the autism piece, I was like, this isn't me. I have to totally redo this in order for it to actually represent my experience in the moment. And I think that is perhaps the key, or the essence of, like I could say, the no self or the true self, or whatever you want to call it. That if we land in the moment, even for a moment, that entails actually having no anchor in the past and no prospects in the future. Like the moment is the moment by definition. We can't refer to anything in the past or anything we imagine in the future. We can only refer to this moment, and that actually is annihilating. I think that's what a lot of spiritual seekers and writers and whatnot don't acknowledge, that actually landing in the moment is terrifying in a sense, or it isn't, because you're in the moment, so there's nothing to be afraid of. But I mean, to the ego that depends upon the continuity of a self, that is the ultimate surrender, essentially. Just letting go of all points of reference. And so that's a real, as I'm sure you can imagine and probably know yourself, that as a writer that's a real challenge, because writing, we're trying to make it all fit together, and make it consistent and make a narrative, and actually that's illusory. That's the irony of what I'm writing more and more, is that all the way that we use language to stitch a self together and to stitch our experience together is essentially illusory.
Yeah, I think you've done a very good job of talking about the tragic, ironic side of trying to write one's way out or write one's way through these things. But of course, then the other side of it is that on the one hand, this becomes work that other people can then model or respond to or intuit themselves through the work. So it's sort of like you're helping wake up other people to the conundrum that then they're going to have to deal with on their own.
Right.
So that's a positive factor. But there's another one as well, which is that I believe And I think the way that you've talked about your own work and the work that I've read it indicates is that there's a way in which, even though there's a kind of tragic or ironic dimension to it, that the labor of attempting to articulate in language, in linear form, in argument, in reason, all of that stuff which we also come to suspect or really question in terms of its ultimate value or good for you as an individual, that nonetheless the work of doing that, unlike anything else, verbal therapy, all the arts, whatever, there's something particular about the burden of trying to really articulate what you think about something in language to other people that itself is a pretty shamanic process. It's just that, unfortunately, you're not, taking drugs with crazy drums around you. You're like sitting in front of a computer for 8 hours. But it's also a really powerful tool, I think.
Yeah, I think it probably has to do with making conscious something that is unconscious, because we're actually all doing that. Like Nietzsche said, we're great artists, and we know we're all stitching together our reality all day long with our internal monologue or dialogue or trialogue or however many demons we've got chattering away. And so when we're writing, it is a deprogramming. You're recognizing and you're learning to use the tools by which you were programmed, and you program yourself all day long, telling yourself, I am this way and I'm that way and I like that and I don't like this and I'm going to be this. And that's an unconscious process that, as we know, that spiritual disciplines are all about, trying to silence the mind. Well, writing is about trying to reprogram the mind, I think, or not just the mind. I think it's the body, actually. I think the mind programs the body. So I think it's a bodily thing, and this is something that I've been feeling more and more with writing, and the Dick piece, I think, was a new stage for me. That it's funny because Dick has that double entendre, but to be embodied, to actually be embodied while writing and by writing means to write from the whole body, not just with the mind, but with the whole body, and that's a very different thing.
That's so funny. I love that, and for me, one of the elements of that, this may be a little off track. We don't have that much time left, but it's just come up. Is what subtle allies we invoke in order to continue writing. The caffeine is a very obvious one. People love to take caffeine when they're writing, but I try to be very intentional about it. So I drink tea. I drink a certain kind of tea. I'm very aware of making the tea, and when I do that, it's partly as an acknowledgement of the energetic body, the taste body, the fact that I'm in a world of other objects and other plants and other spirits that are kind of maintaining me. And it's one of the ways that I try to do that, and to actually kind of experiment. What are some other, mild psychoactives that can aid in writing? And lately I've been on this calamus kick, this sort of chewing this very bitter root, but it has a very interesting kind of euphoric energy going on to it. It's a subtle trace, but it's sort of bitter. And so I'm sitting there and I'm in that disembodied writing space, but I'm also very much feeling my mouth, feeling this bitterness, I'm feeling the energy, the slight energy twist to it. And it's very much what you're talking about. It's like bringing the body into the moment.
Right. See, and that communicates, and I wrote about this a while back, the mirror neurons in the brain state, how the writing communicates much more than what's just there in the words. It communicates the brain state that the person was in when they wrote that piece. And then the reader, if they're able to match that brain state, they have the full experience. So when we like a piece or a writer, it has as much or more to do with the actual state that person was in when they were writing it, which I would say is more than just the brain state, but the whole body state.
I think you're very correct with that. And another point that your writing helped illuminate for me is this idea, this encouragement for people to follow and analyze, but closely, what it is that really draws them. Like, so what? You love Star Trek, or you love horror novels, or you're fascinated by UFO channeling, or whatever it is, and maybe you kind of believe it, or maybe you're just fascinated by it, but there's a reason that it's that thing and nothing else. It's a reason that it's Tarzan and not pirates. Whatever the thing is, and then going, and it's a wonderful invitation to go in there with intelligence and analysis, but also a kind of imaginative sensibility. And you'll find that there are these multiple levels. And the thing that really struck me is, again, I mean, I've done so much work on Philip K. Dick, and I talk about it a lot, is the more and more time I spent with it, the more I realized that I was responding to a certain depressive affect in his work that was so intimately my own that I felt recognized in a way, even if he wasn't actually writing about depression or about a certain grim way of looking at the world. I was able to work myself through that, and as I became more aware of that, both its insights and it's the traps that it makes, it's been part of my own process of learning through things. So I want to thank you for clarifying that for me.
Oh, great. Well, you're welcome. Yeah, I didn't have such a strong connection to Dick until I wrote this piece. I mean, I never felt like a dickhead. I still don't. But I do feel much more deeply connected to him through writing this piece. And part of it has to do, I think, with what you just touched on. I didn't think about the depressive aspect, but it occurred to me that unlike other writers that I've admired and written about, like Castaneda or Strieber, Philip K. Dick was writing because he had to write. He was writing to explore himself and to explore the word. He wasn't writing in order to be somebody or try and achieve something.
I have to cut in here because we're going to close, but that's sort of what your writing is about. You're writing because you have to write through yourself, and it really makes a very interesting body of work. So
great.
I got to close it up. Thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was great.
All right, folks. Oh, yeah, just to let you know, if you want to follow more of Jason's work, go to Auticulture.com, AUTICULTURE. So from me and Majid, all you out there, keep your minds open.